And of course, because this is a feast day for the news gods, what's happening right now in Hanoi is happening for this president against just a catastrophic domestic news backdrop. Today, in marathon testimony before the House Oversight Committee, the president's longtime personal lawyer made multiple serious allegations of potentially criminal wrongdoing by President Trump. Allegations that span the time period before the 2016 presidential campaign, during that campaign, and since Mr. Trump has been president. So, sort of lay of the land here for how I think this hour is going to go, breaking news notwithstanding. What I think we're going to get through tonight is that we're going to try to talk in detail about the four major areas of criminal allegations that Michael Cohen spelled out today concerning the president. We're going to have expert advice here in studio about the legal strength of Michael Cohen's contentions and how much more worried President Trump ought to be about his own legal standing after Cohen's testimony today. We're also going to speak with one of the members of the committee today who questioned Mr. Cohen and who elicited herself some very important information. Because these are criminal allegations against the president, though, I think it is worth stressing at the outset that when you are talking about allegations of criminal behavior by a sitting president, those allegations live sort of on, like, I guess it's parallel paths. Not exactly parallel. I think they might intersect at some point down the road, but there's at least two paths here when you're talking about a president and potential criminal behavior. And one clear path is determined by the fact that this was congressional testimony today, right? Congress itself has the responsibility of oversight and of investigating credible allegations like this about the executive branch, up to and including the president himself. So that's one straightforward path here, right? The straightforward way a congressional committee is supposed to handle allegations like this, information like this, is that they're supposed to investigate it themselves. And if the allegations are substantiated and if members of Congress believe it's warranted, that information is supposed to become the basis for possible impeachment proceedings in the House, which could eventually lead to a trial in the Senate, which could eventually lead to a president being removed from office. That's the clear, straightforward constitutional path here. But the other path, the other perhaps parallel, perhaps intersecting path, is the path of the criminal law. And one of the things about living through this Trump era is that it has never been fully clear to us, the American people, throughout the scandals of this presidency, just how susceptible this sitting president might be to potential prosecution himself, not only in Congress and a potential impeachment proceeding, but potentially in a court of law as well. There is, of course, somewhat contested Justice Department policy about whether or not a president can be indicted and prosecuted while he is serving in office. And that is not necessarily an open and shut case, in part because of the prospect that the president could be indicted, but the indictment could be sealed until the time that he leaves office. That puts it in sort of a gray area in terms of how much influence prosecutors can potentially have on the future of a presidency. If a sealed indictment is used as the basis for some sort of negotiation with the president or his representatives, the idea that there's a black and white prohibition on whether or not a president faces prosecution and or indictment gets a little woolly. And we don't need to go through the long and short of that Justice Department policy and the controversy over that here. But I mean, we've lived through some of this already. I mean, already in the criminal case involving Michael Cohen, in which he pled guilty to multiple felonies, and for which he will start serving a prison sentence in a matter of weeks. Already in the Cohen case in the Southern District of New York, federal prosecutors from that Southern District of New York have already described President Trump as personally implicated in two of the felonies to which Cohen pled guilty. Well, on top of that, one of the surprise revelations from today's hearing came in an interaction between Michael Cohen and Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi. In that interaction, Cohen revealed that those same prosecutors in the Southern District of New York are, according to him, looking at other things that may also relate to the president himself.
When was the last communication with President Trump or someone acting on his behalf?
I don't have the specific date, but it was a while ago.
Okay. Do you have a general time frame?
I would suspect it was within 2 months post the raid of my, my home,
Okay, so
hotel,
early fall of last year, generally.
generally.
And what did he or his agent communicate to you?
Unfortunately, this topic is actually something that's being investigated right now by the Southern District of New York, and I've been asked by them not to discuss and not to talk about these issues.
Fair enough.
Michael Cohen telling Congressman Krishnamurthy today that something about his interactions with the president after the FBI raided Cohen's home and office, serving search warrants to seize materials from him, something about interactions he may have had with the president or the president's agent, according to Mr. Cohen, are the subject of a current investigation right now by the Southern District of New York. Now, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of anything like that before in all of the open source reporting that we have done on this scandal and related matters. But if this is reference to another open investigation by federal prosecutors involving the sitting president, then I mean, that's big news, and it's news that we did not have before today. And then right away, right after that revelation in today's hearing, there was more, and it came next in this same back and forth between Raja Krishnamurthy and Michael Cohen.
Fair enough. Is there any other wrongdoing or illegal act that you are aware of regarding Donald Trump that we haven't yet discussed today?
Yes, and again, those are part of the investigation that's currently being looked at by the Southern District of New York.
Wrongdoing or illegal acts you're aware of regarding Donald Trump? Yes. We do not know what Michael Cohen is referring to there. And honestly, we don't know if he's right? But if he's right, what he's describing is a previously unknown, open, ongoing federal criminal investigation involving something related to the president. Now, Michael Cohen says that investigation is being pursued by the Southern District of New York. That is the U.S. Attorney's Office that prosecuted him. That is the U.S. Attorney's Office in which prosecutors have already told a federal judge in the Cohen case that it was the president who directed the commission of those 2 campaign finance felonies to which Cohen has pled guilty. Now, one quiet subplot that has been unfolding over the last few days is the prospect that the Judiciary Committee in Congress has obtained evidence that the president has been leaning on that U.S. Attorney's Office, that the president has been trying to get Justice Department officials to intervene in that office in the Southern District of New York to try to get his own preferred prosecutor to take over the investigations in that office that pertain to Michael Cohen and that potentially pertain to the president as well. This has been sort of a quiet subplot. It has unfolded largely around the scandal involving Matthew Whitaker having served as acting attorney general for a short time. But if the federal prosecutors who have already accused the president of being implicated in 2 felonies are now today revealed to be pursuing additional criminal investigations that also relate to the president, then any potential effort by the president to mess with that U.S. Attorney's Office, that may quickly become one of the most important stories in the whole country, particularly if the felonies already prosecuted by that office against Cohen are about to metastasize into serious trouble for the president and for his business and for his family.
I want to focus my questions on the smoking gun document you have provided this committee. This document is compelling evidence of federal and state crimes, including financial fraud. You provided this committee with a check from President Donald J. Trump's revocable trust account, which is marked as Exhibit 5B. It is a check for $35,000, and it is dated March 17, 2017, after the president took office. It's right now on the screen. Do you see it, sir?
Yes, sir.
Today, you testified that the check was signed by Donald Trump Jr. and the Trump Organization CFO, Alan Weisselberg. Is that correct?
That is correct.
As federal prosecutors laid out in their criminal charges, payments like this check resulted in numerous false statements in the books and records of the Trump Organization. And it's important for the American public to understand this. Nothing to do with collusion. This is financial fraud, garden variety financial fraud. It was disguised as a payment for legal services to you. But this was not a payment for legal services, was it, Mr. Cohen?
No, sir.
It could give rise to serious state and federal criminal liability if a corporation is cooking its books. Based on your testimony today, Donald Trump Jr. and Alan Weisselberg directed this payment to you and approved this payment. Is that right?
Mr. Trump initially acknowledged the obligation, the debt. Myself and Alan Weisselberg went back to his office, and I was instructed by Alan at the time that they were going to do this over 12 installments. And what he decided to do then was to have me send an invoice, in which case they can have a check cut. And then, yes, the answer would be yes to your follow-up.
And Donald Trump Jr. obviously signed off on this.
Yes, well, it would either be Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr., and/or Alan Weisselberg, but always Alan Weisselberg on the check.
I just want the American public to understand the explosive nature of your testimony in this document. Are you telling us, Mr. Cohen, that the president directed transactions in conspiracy with Alan Weisselberg and his son, Donald Trump Jr., as part of a criminal conspiracy of financial fraud? Is that your testimony today?
Yes.
And do you know if this criminal financial scheme that the president, Alan Weisselberg, and Donald Trump Jr. are involved in is being investigated by the Southern District of New York?
I'd rather not discuss that question because it could be part of an investigation that's currently ongoing.
But I just want the American public to understand that solely apart from Bob Mueller's investigation, there is garden variety financial fraud. And your allegation and the explosive smoking gun document suggests that the president, his son, and his CFO may be involved in a criminal conspiracy. And isn't it true, Mr. Cohen, that this criminal conspiracy that involved 4 people, that there's only one person so far who suffered the repercussions, and that's why you're in jail?
We'll be going to jail, yes.
There are 3 other people, though, who were equally involved in this conspiracy. Is that true?
It is true.
Congressman Ro Khanna today putting a fine point on one of the 4 serious allegations of criminal behavior made against the president and those close to him today. The garden variety financial fraud, as he put it, at issue here is about the payment of $130,000 to stop a woman from saying before the election that she had been sexually involved with President Trump. That payment has been prosecuted in federal court already as an illegal campaign contribution. Today, the man who made the payment produced a check signed by President Trump, and he produced a check apparently signed by President Trump's eldest son, Donald Jr., and co-signed by the CFO of the Trump Organization, Alan Weisselberg. Cohen says there are 9 other checks in total, all of which add up to his reimbursement for making those illegal campaign contributions. He says he will provide those other 9 checks to the committee as well. Cohen also said today that this is potentially a matter of ongoing investigation in, naturally, the Southern District of New York. So what does this mean? Obviously, Michael Cohen is already going to prison for this. But what does this mean now that he's produced these documents and made these allegations? What does this mean for the other entities who he says were wittingly involved in this crime? The president's business, its executives, including his eldest son, Donald Jr., who signed that check, who Mr. Cohen today said was executive 2 in his own criminal charging documents. That's Don Jr. What does it mean also for individual 1, as President Trump is described in Mr. Cohen's charging documents? I mean, if the president is already identified as a conspirator in those felonies, if his name is in fact on those checks and those prosecutors are still actively pursuing it, how much worse are things for the president himself? Let's bring in some expert help on that. Joining us now is Joyce Vance, former U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Alabama. Joyce, thank you for being here tonight. I know it has been a dense day of following all this information.
It's a smorgasbord kind of day, right?
Cohen provides these 2 checks from March and August of 2017, one signed by the president, one signed by the CFO and his eldest son. Ro Khanna there called that evidence of a criminal conspiracy of financial fraud. Does that make sense as a legal matter?
It does and it doesn't. It does in the sense that it looks like there's this ongoing effort to take payments that are related to the campaign and turn them into something that's tax deductible on the company's books. Where I'm less clear, though, is when we talk about who's involved in a conspiracy. And I hate this idea of questioning witnesses in 5-minute blips, because just when they get to the good points, they cut off. And we really needed to hear more about Donald Trump Jr.'s involvement, about Eric Trump's involvement. Did they know what was involved when they were signing those checks, or did someone just put them in front of them? There's certainly a lot that needs to be investigated here.
He certainly was. He gave a detailed and repeated testimony about Alan Weisselberg having essentially hatched the plot at Trump's direction in conjunction with Cohen.
That part seemed clear, and we know Weisselberg has immunity for some testimony that he gave to Southern District of New York. We don't know the contours of that. It could be about this or something else.
Let me ask, I want to play one other piece of tape on this subject because it goes to the idea that there was not just a crime committed here in terms of this illegal campaign contribution, but there may have also been a crime or criminal conspiracy, or, I mean, I'll let you explain it, in terms of covering it up, in terms of trying to make this look like something that it wasn't. So I want to play a little exchange for you that happened between Cohen and Congresswoman Katie Hill. Check it out.
I had gone into Mr. Trump's office, as I did after each and every conversation. And he had told me that he had spoken to a couple of friends, and it's $130,000. It's not a lot of money, and we should just do it. So go ahead and do it. And I was at the time with Alan Weisselberg, where he directed us to go back to Mr. Weisselberg's office and figure this all out.
Did the president call you to coordinate on public messaging about the payments to Ms. Clifford's in or around February 2018?
Yes.
What did the president ask or suggest that you say about the payments or reimbursements?
He was not knowledgeable of these reimbursements, and he wasn't knowledgeable of my actions.
He asked you to say that.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. In addition to the personal check for $35,000 in July 2017, is there additional corroborating evidence that Mr. Trump, while a sitting president of the United States, directly reimbursed you hush money as part of a criminal scheme to violate campaign finance laws?
There are 11 checks that I received for the year. The reason why 11, because, as I stated before, one had 2 checks.
And you have copies of all of those?
I can get copies. I'd have to go to the bank.
So we will
Yes.
be able to get copies of all 11 checks that Mr. Trump provided to you as part of this criminal scheme?
It's either from his personal account, as what was demonstrated in the exhibit, or it would come from the Donald J. Trump account, the trust account.
So two
Thank you,
issues.
Mr. Cohen.
Two issues are highlighted there, Joyce. One is the source of the funds. The funds seem to have come from a couple of different places, the president's personal account and through a trust that oversees his businesses. But then also Cohen just bluntly asserting that the president told him to lie and to say that the president didn't know about these reimbursements and he didn't know what Cohen was doing when, according to him, the president plainly knew both of those things. Are either of those things legally significant? The source of the funds or lying about it?
They're incredibly significant because here's what we see happening. This is a conspiracy. A conspiracy is just an agreement to achieve an illegal end. And what they're doing here is covering up their misconduct. They're agreeing both to engage in the misconduct and to cover it up. And when you enter into a criminal conspiracy, you don't usually sign on the dotted line like you do on a contract. You have these kind of conversations where you have the president saying, now here's what you should say if this comes up. And what he's directing Cohen to say is not the truth, and it's designed to conceal the criminal act.
Does it matter whether the president did this during the campaign or when he was president?
What matters is that he does it in an effort to influence the outcome of the campaign, and that the conspiracy, the cover-up, the payments continue after the election. Apparently, if we believe Cohen, and maybe the worst part of this, and it makes me think of your podcast Bagman, which I loved, is we have this little vignette of Cohen going to visit Trump in the Oval Office for the first time. And there's conversation about the checks in the Oval Office. So we have this notion that the president in the Oval Office is covering up the campaign finance violation.
The president from the Oval Office is talking about completing the act of covering up those illegal donations.
Exactly.
All right, Joyce, if you'll stay with us, I'm going to chain you to the chair because we have a lot to get to tonight. We're also going to be talking live with a member of Congress who was part of the questioning of Michael Cohen today. We got lots to get to. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.